Hello and welcome to Lecture 2 on the classical era. Last time I started off by defining the word classical as an approach to the arts or literature, as a sort of a worldview of aesthetics, perhaps. And I also talked about some of the historical background of this period, which of course is roughly 1750 to 1820. So we worked through all that, and now we're going to work through the characteristics of the classical style, which are listed beginning page 162 in the latest version of the Kamian text. We'll talk about the classical orchestra, how it differs from the Baroque orchestra, about classical forms, very, very important. Remember, the whole concept of form is so integral to the classical approach, because the basic belief is that it is form which generates beauty. That is, achieving a certain balance, symmetry, proportion of form is where beauty comes from, at least to the classically minded person. And then we have a section on the composer, patron, and public in the classical period, sort of the role of the composer, what his working circumstances were, who was he composing for, etc. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about Vienna itself in that context. Vienna, not to be confused with Venice, by the way. I had mentioned in the Baroque era that Venice, which is in Italy, was sort of a cultural capital, certainly within music, but in the other arts as well, during the Baroque era. Well, during the classical era, it is almost indisputable that Vienna, which is the capital of modern-day Austria, was back then the capital of something called the Holy Roman Empire. Vienna was really the leading musical center of the classical period. Anyway, let's start with the characteristics of the classical style. And as I go through each one of these, try and think about how each one of them relates to the classical approach in general, in any of the arts. Right? Classicism as sort of a philosophy of aesthetics. The idea that beauty is not really just in the eye of the beholder, that it is generated by applying certain formal principles, etc. And also think about how each one of these differs from the characteristics of the Baroque era. In fact, what I might do is at some point find the similar section in the chapter on the Baroque era. It's a little easier to do if you have the paper book rather than the online book, but it's probably possible to do this if you have it on two different screens and just kind of flip back and forth between the two. So in the Baroque era, we have a section, Characteristics of Baroque Music, and it begins on page 104. And it goes down through several characteristics. And now over here on page 162, we have the same kind of thing applying to the classical style. And take note of how these might be similar, might be different. Okay. So the first thing they mention is contrast of mood. Remember, these are general principles that we're applying to an awful lot of music by many, many different composers over a 70-year period. So we have to generalize, but it is generally true that great variety and contrast of mood receive new emphasis in classical music, whereas a late Baroque piece might convey a single emotion. Classical compositions fluctuate in mood. So again, think back to the Baroque and this idea that in the Baroque era, the composer's job was to generate a mood on the part of the listener. This isn't, such a hard idea to understand. The composer wants the listener to feel something specific. And the idea is you don't want to mix your messages, at least not within a single piece or a single movement of a multi-movement piece. You want to focus on just that one emotion so that whoever is listening really feels it deeply. The classical idea is this is kind of disproportionate. There's no symmetry there. We have to balance out contrasting moods, right? So, dramatic, turbulent music might lead into a carefree dance tune. Not only are there contrasting themes within a movement, but there may be also striking contrasts within a single theme. So not only within a certain movement will we have fluctuations in mood, but even within a section of a movement. So as we will see, when we talk more in detail about form, just giving you an example of this idea, the most important type of form, which we will learn about shortly in the classical era, is something called sonata form. Now, we've already heard about the word sonata. It's a title of a work, of an instrumental work, right? But we also have this thing which, unfortunately, which music theorists over the years have called sonata form. Sonata form refers to a specific type of structure very commonly found in the classical era. And this is found in pieces that might not have the title sonata. So a symphony, a string quartet, or a sonata would usually have a first movement which is in something called sonata form. The first thing we hear in sonata form is we hear two contrasting themes. The first theme, and then maybe a little transition passage called a bridge, and the second theme. And these two themes are almost always very different in character. The first theme is usually of a more sort of attention-getting, maybe more aggressive character. We might say a more masculine character. And the second theme is usually gentler, maybe curvier, more lyrical, maybe more feminine in character. And this isn't really just kind of an accident or me imagining gender roles to themes. It's something that we very commonly find in opera. We have a male character who steps out on stage and he sings his bit, and then we have a female character, and the melodies will be sort of matched to the characters, the style of the melody, right? Helps kind of fill out the character. This kind of contrast in mood happens right in the very beginning, very often, of a piece in the classical era. And that's just one example. We will see examples all through in different genres of music, different forms, the idea of contrast, which, I mean, if we don't have anything that's contrasting, then we can't really have balance or symmetry, right? If we just have one emotion that's always being kind of hammered away at us, which is more the Baroque style, then we don't have that contrast, and we have the feeling that maybe something is just kind of overdone, right? At least that would have been the classical era's kind of criticism of the Baroque style. Remember, the term Baroque itself, as applied to music, is an invention of the classical era. It's a critique by people looking backwards and criticizing the style of the previous time. It says here, mood in classical music may change gradually or suddenly, expressing conflicting surges of elation and depression. But such conflict and contrast are under the firm control of the classical composer. So what they're getting at here is another classical principle, and that is emotional restraint. So I think that the classical composer would agree with the Baroque composer that our job, in part, is to elicit emotions from the listener. But whereas the Baroque composer might believe that these emotions should be as intense as possible, the classical composer would say, well, I don't know about that. Maybe we shouldn't be too overboard in this kind of emotional, we shouldn't tug too hard on the heartstrings or whatever it is. Because if we risk going overboard in emotional expression, trying to get that emotion, whatever it is, then we may have to sacrifice some degree of beauty. And I think, generally speaking, to the classical composer, beauty is the most important thing. And expressing emotions or eliciting emotions in the listener is important, but it can never be done at the expense of beauty. I would say, generally speaking, the Baroque composer might have the opposite point of view, that expressing emotions is the most important thing, and if we have to sacrifice some notion of pure beauty in order to do that, we should be willing to do that. This is why, for example, back in the Baroque, remember this idea of unprepared dissonances, of composers deliberately wanting the listener to hear dissonances or clashes between different tones, because it helped to express certain emotions, especially like, negative emotions like sorrow or anger or whatever, right? So we have a sort of a difference in artistic philosophy, let's say, generally speaking, between these two eras. Emotional restraint, not being overboard in your emotions, is definitely a hallmark of the classical style. Rhythm. Flexibility of rhythm adds variety to classical music. A classical composition has a wealth of rhythmic patterns, whereas a Baroque piece usually contains few patterns that are reiterated throughout. So let's go back to page 104 here and see what they said about, similarly in the Baroque period. They said, that first of all, they talked about unity of mood back in the Baroque. And then they said here under rhythm, unity of mood in Baroque music is conveyed, first of all, by continuity of rhythm. Rhythmic patterns heard at the beginning of a piece are repeated throughout. Not so much the case in the classical era. We have flexibility of rhythm. Instead of having one rhythmic pattern over and over again to convey that one basic mood, we have a variety of different rhythmic patterns, right? Now, we will still probably have one basic tempo throughout a classical piece, with a few exceptions. Some classical pieces have a slow introduction and then a faster tempo, but generally speaking, a classical piece or a movement of a multi-movement classical piece has one basic tempo. But within that tempo, if you have different rhythmic patterns with, let's say, more minute subdivisions of the beat, like 16th notes over here instead of 8th notes over there, or whatever, you can give the impression of if not faster or slower, more energetic or less energetic, right? More motion, less motion, right? And composers did this all the time. The classical style also includes unexpected pauses, syncopations, and frequent changes from long notes to shorter notes. Right? And again, the change from one pattern, one rhythmic pattern to another, may be gradual or it may be sudden. Okay, next one is a big important one, texture. Remember what texture is. This is the whole issue of the role of melody within a piece of music. And there are basically only three different textures. Either you've just got one melody going on and nothing else, that's monophonic. You might have one melody plus some other stuff in the background that is not as important as that one main melody. We call that homophonic texture. And then we have multiple melodies going on simultaneously, each of which is considered to be of more or less equal importance with the others and also independent from the others. That's polyphonic texture. And certainly by the late Baroque era, polyphonic texture was the dominant texture. Right? So, for example, the best example of this is a Bach fugue, is by definition in polyphonic texture. And not just fugues, but many other types of pieces could feature this kind of texture. Well, this changes as we go into the classical period. It says here, in contrast to the polyphonic texture of late Baroque music, classical music is basically homophonic. Right? So the default of the classical composer is homophonic texture, because the idea is, we don't need all that difficult, complicated, it's so demanding to the listener to keep track of multiple melodic lines. Let's just simplify. Simplicity is another classical virtue. Let's keep things simple. For the most part, we will have one main melody and some stuff going on in the background that provides harmony and rhythmic activity and a bass line. That's accompaniment. Melody plus accompaniment, that's homophonic texture. And I would say that if you took all the music during the classical period and just kind of like pointed at some random spot, something like 75-80% of the time, you'd probably find homophonic texture. However, there's always a however. In the classical era, texture is treated as flexibly as rhythm. Pieces can shift smoothly or suddenly from one texture to another. A work may begin homophonically with a melody and simple accompaniment, but then change to more complex polyphonic texture. Right? We might also find, occasional instances of monophonic texture. So, for example, I just thought of a famous example of a piece that begins with monophonic texture that you are probably somewhat familiar with, which is this. Right? One melody and nothing else. So it begins with monophonic texture, and then it goes into homophonic texture. Right? Because we have a melody in the right hand, and this stuff is just providing rhythm and harmony. Right? It's clearly less important than the melody. Right? When composers do employ or deploy polyphonic texture in the classical era, where we usually find it is where the composer wants to intensify the emotion somehow, right? And where we usually find this is in, for example, in sonata form, in the development section of a work in sonata form. And we'll get to what the different sections are, whatever, but just sort of put a pin in this for now. That's very often where we might find some polyphonic texture, because polyphonic texture was something that composers often sort of held in reserve and then deployed at places where they wanted more intensity, let's say, intensity of expression. Then they would break out the polyphonic texture. But otherwise, they would mostly keep things simple and light and stick with good old homophonic texture. Okay. Melody. Again, big contrast with especially the late Baroque. Classical melodies are among the most tuneful and easiest to remember. The themes of even highly sophisticated compositions may have folk or popular flavor. So this is in contrast to especially late Baroque melodies, which you may recall I said are very often akin to like run-on sentences. Right? They're often very continuous. There's a lot of notes in there, and maybe not a lot of places to pause to take a breath. And they are not necessarily like immediately memorable. That's what they mean by tuneful in here. What do you mean to say a melody is tuneful? Meaning it's catchy. Like you hear it once or twice and you can sing it back. That is often not the case with Baroque music. So I'm just thinking of an example off the top of my head. Remember the Bach Brandenburg Concerto from our last unit, and the opening melody, the ritornello melody goes something like this. Etc., etc. It goes on and on. It would be very difficult to just like sing it back, right? You can see I have trouble singing it and finding a place to breathe. Not at all like the typical classical melody. Classical melodies are often inspired by folk tunes. This is a time when classical composers started taking an interest in folk melodies. In part, they did this because they wanted to appeal to, let's say, middle-class audiences who, it's basically sort of like comfort food, If you hear a melody and you go to a concert and you hear a melody and it sounds like some kind of like a nursery rhyme or a lullaby that your mother sang to you, or something that you used to sing with your friends in school, or maybe even something like a hymn that you sang in church. It instantly kind of resonates with you, right? So very often classical melodies are written deliberately in a simplistic, we might say, style, in order to make them more relatable to sort of like middle class audiences. And this is a time, as we will see when we start talking about the composer, the patron, and the public in the classical era. Composers are definitely trying to reach out to a more middle class audience, not necessarily just the high and mighty aristocratic type of audience that might have been more the case in the age of absolutism of the previous musical era, of the Baroque era, right? So this means that classical melodies are very often broken up into phrases, right? And just the same way that folk tunes and hymns are broken up into phrases. Remember, we need a phrase with a cadence at the end, a little sort of a punctuation mark or a resting point, in part because we will run out of breath, if we don't have, for the same reason we have punctuation in language, one of the same reasons anyway. And remember, even if we're playing on an instrument like the violin or the piano, we might want to imitate the kinds of things we do naturally when singing, right? We might want to have like pauses for breath in there, even if we don't necessarily need to breathe into a piano or a violin in order to make the sound. Classical melodies are usually broken up into phrases which are symmetrical, right? So we might have, let's say, a 4-measure phrase which ends with what we might call an open cadence, sort of like the musical equivalent of a question mark, followed by a symmetrical, a phrase of the same length, let's say 4 measures. It's usually some multiple of 2, so it could be 2 measures, 4 measures, 8 measures. The first phrase might end with a weaker cadence, an open cadence, sort of like a question mark. And the following phrase might end with a stronger cadence, more like a period or an exclamation mark, right? When we put 2 phrases together like this, right, we might have something called a period. We might actually put 2 periods next to each other in the same kind of structure and have something called a double period, right? This gets into like music theory stuff that I'm not going to get into too much with you guys, but just be aware that classical melodies are broken up into phrases which are very often symmetrical and have cadences at the end of them to give sort of a pause for breath, which is very much in contrast to the sort of constant motoric motion or run-on sentence quality of, let's say, a late Baroque melody. Okay, and again, lots of examples of this that I could play for you, like off the top of my head, like right, 2 phrases there, or maybe sub-phrases, right? This one ends with a kind of a weak, maybe sort of like a comma, right? And then ends with a period, right? That, by the way, that melody, you might think, oh, that's Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And some people have this idea that Mozart composed Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. He did not. That's an existing folk tune. It was actually called À vous dirai-je maman, as a French folk tune. But Mozart used that tune and composed a set of variations for piano on that tune. We're going to listen later on when we get to the composer Haydn. In one of Haydn's symphonies, there's a melody which is very, very similar to this, that was originally composed by Haydn. It was not something he borrowed, but it's so similar to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I mean, it's rhythmically identical. The shape is very similar, and it shows how composers might use folk tunes, actually just kind of borrow a folk tune and use it, or they would compose newly composed melodies that sound as if they could have been folk tunes because they imitate that style. Okay, moving on. Dynamics and the piano. Classical composers' interest in expressing shades of emotion led to the widespread use of gradual dynamic change, crescendo and decrescendo. So if you recall, again, there's a corresponding entry back in the Baroque chapter. When they talk about dynamics, they talk about something called terraced dynamics, which, as you may recall, terraced dynamics means sudden changes from loud to soft, or from soft to loud, creating kind of a terrace effect, right? Instead of a slope, right? Of gradual. If we had gradual changes from loud to soft or from soft to loud, that would be more of a slope, whereas if the changes are sudden from one step to another, one level to another, we call that a terrace. And what was the reason that Baroque composers used terrace dynamics and not so much gradual changes? Well, it was because of the capabilities of the instruments of the time, specifically the keyboard instruments. The keyboard instruments of the Baroque era were the organ and the harpsichord. The organ and the harpsichord were incapable of gradual changes. You could make sudden changes. You could pull out all the stops on the organ, activate more pipes, or even on the harpsichord, there were stops or knobs you could pull on to engage or disengage additional ranks of strings. Remember, the harpsichord it's sort of like a piano, but when you press down on a key, there's a quill that comes up and plucks a string. Well, you can move the keyboard over by engaging a lever so that it will engage more strings or fewer strings. And on the pipe organ, you can pull some knobs and engage more pipes or fewer pipes. So you can get sudden changes in dynamic level, but there's no way of getting gradual changes. So that means if there's a keyboard player in your group, and remember, if you've got a group of players in the Baroque era, there's going to be a keyboard player in there because of the basso continuo, right? Basso continuo is the rhythm section of the Baroque ensemble. It's always there. There's always a keyboard player, right? If the keyboard player can't make gradual changes in dynamics from loud to soft and vice versa, then there's no point having anyone else do it because it's not going to match with the keyboard. So this is probably the main reason why Baroque era music features sudden changes. Well, now we move into the classical era, and there's a new keyboard instrument called the piano, which was invented precisely to deal with this problem. In fact, the name piano, as you may recall, from Unit 1 when I talked about the different musical instruments, the word piano actually means soft. It's not really the full name of the instrument. The full name is the pianoforte, or sometimes it was called the forte piano, the loud soft or the soft loud, right? That's literally what the name means because that was the new feature of this instrument. It is touch sensitive. You can play an individual note louder or softer depending on how much, with how much force you hit the key. It's actually the speed of the key descent. The faster the key goes down, the louder the sound is going to be. The slower it goes down, the softer it's going to be, right? So now, keyboard players can make crescendos and decrescendos, and since they can do it, others can as well. Now, composers still use terrace dynamics sometimes. They still sometimes do the sudden changes from loud to soft. It's just that now they have the option of having gradual changes as well. So we have flexibility. Remember, each time I talked about one of these new elements or changes from the Baroque style, I said composers still are able to do it the other way. It's just that now they have an additional option. They have more flexibility. We might say flexibility is another aspect of the classical style. We aren't necessarily limited to only one way of doing things because that flexibility, again, gives us the possibility for contrast. Like we had a sudden change in dynamics over here balanced out by a gradual change in dynamics over here. This kind of thing very much appealed to like the classical sensibility, the classical approach. Okay, the piano, they mentioned, this is important, the piano was invented around 1700, but it didn't start to replace the harpsichord, and it was really the harpsichord that it replaced rather than the organ. Did not really start to replace the harpsichord until around the 1770s. And there are several reasons for this. First of all, anytime some new technology is invented, it takes a while, especially, if we're talking 300 years ago, it takes a while for it to be adopted by especially, like if you're J.S. Bach and, you were born in 1685 and you were trained on the organ and the harpsichord. Now, J.S. Bach was actually shown some pianos. There was a piano manufacturer named Silbermann who wanted Bach to try out his pianos and make some recommendations, and Bach tried them out. But these were, early examples. They were probably a lot of bugs that hadn't been worked out yet. And probably Bach was just more comfortable sticking with the instruments that he had been trained on, And that's probably what was true for Bach was probably true for many, many composers. But as time goes on, the piano is refined, the bugs are worked out, and people really begin to appreciate this ability that it has, this touch sensitivity, which the harpsichord and the organ do not. By the time we get to, let's say, Mozart, who was born in 1756, Mozart really composed for the piano, not so much for the harpsichord. Now, the organ is still a fairly important instrument, and it's not exactly like the piano replaces the organ, but obviously there are sort of some practical issues involved with the organ, since it's usually, not always, but usually built into a building like a church, whereas a piano is, can be moved around. So, piano replaces the harpsichord, and all of the classical composers wrote a great deal for piano, much more certainly than for harpsichord. The harpsichord is really being phased out by the time we get to like 1770. And the organ is simply less important from now on as an instrument for keyboard-trained composers. Most of the great composers from this point on are going to be pianists. There are some exceptions. There are some who are like violinists or whatever. But I would say, as we go from here to, the present day in music history, most composers, their main instrument tends to be the piano. Okay, the end of the basso continuo. So, if you recall, the basso continuo was the rhythm section of the Baroque. And it basically consisted of usually two musicians, one of them playing the bass line on a cello, maybe on a bassoon, on some low-pitched melodic instrument, and then another one playing a keyboard instrument like the harpsichord or the organ. And I said, as I just said a few minutes ago, the basso continuo was the rhythm section of the Baroque. It was essential. You always had that basso continuo part written into any music for an ensemble. The basso continuo kind of goes out of fashion as we go into the classical era. Now, we still have a bass line, we still have chords, it's just they're not supplied by this thing we call a basso continuo. And what that means, for one thing, is that the keyboard is no longer a regular instrument in a large ensemble like an orchestra, right? And here we get into, actually, this is a good segue into the next section where they talk about the classical orchestra. In order to appreciate what is different, what is new about the classical orchestra, we have to remember what the Baroque orchestra was. The basic Baroque orchestra was just the members of the violin family, that is, the violin, viola, cello, and bass, plus a harpsichord, or maybe an organ, to play the chords for the basso continuo part. Now, other instruments could be added on sort of an a la carte basis. A composer might say, you know what this really needs is a trumpet. I'm going to add a trumpet, or I'm going to add a flute. But those weren't the standard instruments. The standard instruments were just the bowed stringed instruments plus keyboard, which usually meant harpsichord. As we move into the classical era, we still have the bowed stringed instruments as the core of the orchestra. Violins, usually first and second violins, violas, cellos, and basses. No keyboard, however. The keyboard goes away. It is not a regular member of the symphony orchestra. None of Mozart or Haydn's or Beethoven's symphonies have a piano part. Now, there is a type of piece which we will study called a piano concerto, which is for piano and orchestra, but in that case, the piano is not a member of the orchestra because it's a concerto. And so the pianist is like the featured soloist. He's out front, he or she, and the orchestra is in back, right? And it's for piano and orchestra, not for orchestra with piano in it. Right? So the keyboard goes away as we go into the classical era. But now we have many more additional instruments which are standard in the classical orchestra. And they are listed for you here. So we have the strings, which I mentioned, first violins, second violins, violas, cellos, and basses. In the woodwinds, we have pairs of 4 woodwind instruments: flutes, clarinets, English horn, oboes, and bassoons. Not the English horn, that comes later. Flutes, clarinets, oboes, and bassoons. Right? 2 of each. Right? Then we have some brass instruments. Again, 2 of each. 2 trumpets, 2 French horns. And then percussion. We have 1 pair of timpani. The timpani drums are the ones that are like a boom, 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 boom. Those are the tunable drums, right? And usually they are tuned to scale degree 1 and scale degree 5 of whatever key the piece is in, right? So if you're going to try and keep all this straight, you would say, okay, we still have the 4 members of the violin family, right? And we would probably have at least 4 or 5 violins, first violin, second violin, maybe 2 or 3 violas, 2 or 3 cellos, and maybe a single bass player, maybe 2 bass players. It depends. The orchestra does tend to grow larger as we go through the classical era, certainly by the time we get to Beethoven. But it grows larger by simply adding more people playing on each part, for the most part. It grows larger like in the strings, especially, because the strings are really the heart of the orchestra. These other instruments, so we have woodwinds, brass, and percussion. Just remember, 4 pairs of woodwinds, 2 pairs of brass, and 1 pair of percussion instruments. All right. All of the other instruments which you might see in a modern symphony orchestra, like the harp, like all the array of percussion instruments you might see, the English horn, like the baritone, the bass clarinet, the contrabassoon, these others are added later when we get to our next era, the Romantic era. So the orchestra goes through this period of like evolution and growth. Begins in the Baroque era and grows, adds instruments in the classical era, will continue to grow and add instruments as we move into the Romantic era. But notice what this does. With these additional instruments, it gives us more opportunities for contrast and balance, right, and variety. So, for example, if we're composing a symphony, we might have a theme, a melody, that is presented first by the strings. And then for a sense of contrast, we might have it then played by the woodwinds, right? It gives us a nice symmetry, like, oh, strings over here, woodwinds over there. It gives us more flexibility because we have more tone colors available to us. It's not just that string sound, which was the basic sound that the Baroque composer had to work with, the Baroque orchestral composer. Right? Let's see, what else do they have to say here about the classical era? The number of musicians was greater, you could probably figure this out. The number of musicians was greater in a classical orchestra than in a Baroque group, although practice varied considerably from place to place. Haydn, the oldest of our 3 main classical composers we will look at, Haydn directed a private orchestra of only 25 players from 1761 to 1790. But for public concerts in London, he led an orchestra of 60, so more than double. So if you have more players available, if it's maybe a bigger hall that you're playing in, it's a bigger occasion, you might have you might hire more musicians, and they will double up, especially in the string sections. You'll just have more people playing first violin, second violin, etc. This is important too. Classical composers exploited the individual tone colors of orchestral instruments. Unlike Baroque composers, they did not treat one instrument like another. In the Baroque era, it is less true than in the classical era that composers considered the individual personalities of different instruments. They treated instruments kind of very interchangeably. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, you very often hear like the music of J.S. Bach played on instruments that it was not intended to be played on. Beginning, first of all, with the piano. Bach never really wrote anything specifically for piano. He wrote for organ, he wrote for harpsichord. But, of course, pianists have been playing his music since, well, for at least 250 years, since the invention of the piano itself. And it sounds amazing on the piano. Now, there are some purists, some harpsichord players say, you shouldn't play Bach on the piano because, he didn't play it. Whatever. It sounds great on the piano. In fact, it sounds great on pretty much anything. There's, I don't know if you've ever heard of Switched On Bach. This was a synthesizer artist who recorded lots and lots of J.S. Bach music on the synthesizer. This is back when the synthesizer was like a new thing in the 1960s. Wendy Williams is her name. And Bach sounds pretty amazing on the synthesizer. It sounds great on anything. You could take a Bach piece that was written for organ and play it with an ensemble of flutes or violins, and it sounds great. It doesn't suffer, it doesn't sound wrong or bad or anything. This is not so much the case for classical era music, in which time composers treated instruments differently according to their capabilities, according to the things that they were especially good at, that to sort of highlight the strengths and weaknesses, or, well, not the weaknesses, but highlight the strengths and mitigate, downplay the weaknesses of certain instruments. So this is when we have the beginning of really the practice of orchestration. And orchestration is going to be a huge deal going into the next era, the Romantic era, but it really has its beginnings here as composers now have to deal with a greater variety of instruments, and they start thinking like, well, you know what, this melody is maybe better suited for a flute than for a violin, or this melody would really sound best on an oboe. This is an oboe-esque kind of melody. It would be much more effective on an oboe than, let's say, a violin or a trumpet. So composers begin thinking in this way of the particular qualities of certain instruments and of combinations of instruments that have a certain color. All right. It says here, each section of the classical orchestra had a special role. The strings were the most important section, with the first violins taking the melody most of the time, and the lower strings providing an accompaniment. The woodwinds added contrasting tone colors and were often given melodic solos. Horns and trumpets brought power to loud passages and filled out the harmony, but they did not usually play the main melody, etc. Let's talk a little bit about classical forms. Now, I'm only going to give sort of an introduction to classical forms because we're going to spend quite a bit of time in subsequent lectures talking about specific types of forms and where they are found in multi-movement works of the classical era. And I'm just going to say right off the beginning, we are going to spend more time on instrumental music than on vocal genres. So this is something to keep in mind. Remember I said that during the Baroque era, the previous era, we have over time a sort of a much greater importance in instrumental music. Composers begin writing more instrumental music than vocal music. And of course, even the vocal music also incorporates instruments like opera, oratorio, cantata, etc. This trend continues, or let's say solidifies, so that we're just going to have much more purely instrumental music to talk about. Now, classical composers, of course, did write vocal music as well. They wrote masses, right, which is a genre that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, right? Now, a mass by Mozart or Haydn doesn't sound like a mass by Machaut or Palestrina, but the genre is the same. It's a setting of the ordinary prayers of the Mass. So that's a vocal work, and it would be for, unlike, let's say, a Mass by Palestrina, it would be for choir and maybe vocal soloists and orchestra and instruments together. They wrote operas, certainly. Mozart was among the greatest opera composers of all time. Haydn wrote operas, although his operas aren't performed very much. Beethoven wrote only one opera. He had some problems producing this opera, and so he decided never to do that again. But all three of them also wrote oratorios and cantatas. So these same genres that we learned about last time continue on, and we're just for in the interest of of time, we're not going to talk too much about vocal works, although we will look at a couple of examples, like there's a Mozart opera, an excerpt from an opera we will look at. We will spend much more time on instrumental genres, right? So now, keep in mind the distinction between a genre and a form, right? And in thinking about genres, I realized that you guys might think of like, oh yeah, I know about different genres. There's rock, that's one genre. Jazz is another genre. Classical is a genre. That's not what I mean. By genre, I mean the type of piece that it is, which is usually revealed in the title, right? So the main genres of the classical era that we will look at are, in no particular order, the symphony, which is a work for orchestra, multi-movement work for orchestra, full orchestra. The concerto, which is a work for orchestra plus individual soloist. And I should mention here, remember in the Baroque era we had two different types of concerto. We had the concerto grosso, which was orchestra plus small group, and we had the solo concerto, which was concerto plus individual soloist. The concerto grosso kind of goes away. It is no longer in fashion as we move into the classical period, and it's the solo concerto which carries on and is still a piece for solo instrument plus orchestra. It's still a three-movement work with a fast movement, a slow movement, and then another fast movement at the end, right? Whereas a symphony is almost always a four-movement work. Okay, so symphony is one genre. The concerto is another genre. The sonata, the title sonata, right, an instrumental work, is another genre. There are sonatas for piano, solo sonatas. There are sonatas for, let's say, violin, which usually means violin and piano. The piano is accompanying the violin. Or a cello sonata for cello and piano. It almost always means there's also going to be piano accompanying the soloist, the violinist, or the cellist, or the flutist, or whatever it is. Right? So, symphony, the concerto, the sonata, and then we have various types of chamber music, music for small groups. The most important of these, and there are many different genres of chamber music, but the most important, and the one that we're going to look at in more detail, is the string quartet, right? Which is for 4 string players, 2 violinists, viola, and cello. There is no bass in a string quartet. 2 violinists, viola, and cello. But there are also other genres of chamber music, like the serenade, or the piano trio, which is not for 3 pianos, is usually for piano, violin, and cello, right? So any piece for a small group of instruments is chamber music, just as it was back in the Baroque. And chamber music is very, very popular during the classical era because it's not just for professionals, it's also for amateurs. And composers often wrote with amateurs in mind, right? Because there are more amateurs than there are professionals, and you can sell more music that way, all right? Anyway, that's something I'll get into when I start talking about the composer, patron, and public. Let's stick with these different genres and forms, okay? All of these different genres that I talked about employ multi-movement forms, right? So a classical symphony is a multi-movement piece, as is a concerto, as is a sonata, as is a piece of chamber music like a string quartet. Almost all of the, composers usually conceived of instrumental works as multi-movement, right? Probably the one main exception to this is composers would often compose a theme and variations as a single standalone piece, very often for piano. Sort of like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star variations by Mozart, which is not the real title. It's variations on À vous dirai-je maman, right? And this is one of many, many variation sets that Mozart wrote. And it's just a standalone piece. The theme is presented, and then there's a series of variations on that theme, and the whole thing lasts, could last 10 minutes, 15 minutes for a larger theme and variations. But other than that, all of these different genres are multi-movement. And not only that, but we have expected forms as the first movement, the second movement, the third movement, and the finale, right? Now, keep in mind that some pieces are generally 4 movement and some are only 3, right? Now, the piece that is 3 movement, and this is review really, is the concerto. The concerto is always 3 movements, right? Fast movement, slow movement, and concluding fast movement. The symphony is always 4. Notice that it's the third one, at least counting this way, that I'm leaving out. In a symphony, we usually have a fast movement to start things out, a lyrical, contrasting, slow movement, a third movement which is dance-like, right? It's definitely in the style of a dance. It's a stylized dance, usually a minuet, which was the most popular dance in the 18th century, early 19th century. And then a final movement, which is fast in tempo. In a 3-movement work, like a concerto, it is this dance-like third movement which is left out. Now, obviously the concerto has 3 movements, but it does not have a dance-like third movement the way that a symphony would. Right. So you got your symphony, 4 movements. You got your concerto, only 3 movements because the dance-like movement, which is usually third in the sequence, is left out. Then you have, let's say, the string quartet, usually 4 movements. In terms of its form, the genre of a string quartet is just like a symphony, almost always. Right? First movement is fast, second movement is slow and song-like, third movement is dance-like, fourth movement is fast again. How about a sonata for a solo instrument, like a piano sonata? Here it depends. If we're talking about a Haydn or Mozart sonata, then it's probably only 3 movements, and the middle movement may or may not be dance-like, but it's probably a 3-movement work. When we get to Beethoven, the sonatas could be 3 movements, or they could be 4. In other words, sort of similar to a symphony in terms of the expected type of mood and tempo in each of those 4. There are some Beethoven sonatas that have only 2 movements. There's some that have more than 4, right? It's the same with his string quartets, by the way. All bets are off when we get to Beethoven. Beethoven is an experimenter, and he is doing things a little differently than his predecessors, Mozart and Haydn. But we have certain forms that we expect in each of these movements, and I'll go over them in much more detail in subsequent lectures, but since I'm running short on time, first movements are almost always in sonata form. What is sonata form? You'll learn in the next lecture. Second movements, slow in tempo, lyrical, song-like in mood, could be in any form, really. The composer is free to choose whichever form he feels like. but it will probably not be in sonata form because the first movement was in sonata form, and we will want to have some contrast. So it might be in theme and variation form. It might be in some kind of a ternary form. There are lots of possibilities. The third movement of a four-movement piece, right, the dance-like movement, if we have one, like if it's a symphony or a string quartet, that movement will be in ternary form. Ternary form means having three sections. That's where the ternary, like as opposed to binary, means having only two sections. Ternary means having three sections, and those sections are an A, the first section, a contrasting B, and a return of the A section. A, B, A. That's ternary form. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's the rough outline of any piece in ternary form. A, B, A. That's what it means. How about the last movement? Last movement could be in sonata form, like the first movement is, but more often than not, it will be in rondo form. Rondo form comes in two varieties, and again, I'm just going to lay them out here in terms of their different sections. The two varieties are the short rondo, which is A, B, A, C, A, and all those letters just correspond to contrasting sections. And then there's the long rondo, which is A, B, A, C, A, B, A. So the only difference between the short rondo and the long rondo is in the long rondo, we bring back the B section again towards the end, but having done that, we really want to conclude with the A section, right? In a rondo, every other section is always A. A, B, A, C, A, with a short rondo, A, B, A, C, A, B, A for the long rondo. And you can see the idea here is, remember, in musical form, we have to balance out repetitiveness, repetition, which provides familiarity, with contrast. We want to hear familiar things repeated, but we also want to hear some new things, right? So the idea in a rondo is we keep on bringing back the main theme that we heard at the beginning, but in between the appearances of the main theme, we have contrasting material. Something we might call B over here, something we might call C over here. It is similar to, it's not exactly the same, but you might have noticed that it's similar to the ritornello form that we learned about back in the Baroque era. It's different, but it's pretty similar, right? Remember, in ritornello form, what we might call the A theme is the ritornello, and it returns periodically. And in between those returns, we have contrasting episodes, right? Rondo form is not exactly the same, but it's similar enough that I think it's useful to relate those two in your mind. We will learn in much more detail about those as we go forward. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about form, right? Okay, very quickly, I just want to go over this section on composer, patron, and public in the classical period. And right off the bat, I should mention here, we are going to focus on three composers only, right? There were many, many great composers in the classical era, but we're going to focus on just these three because it is generally, first of all, we only have so much time, and these three are generally considered to be the best three of this time period. There's really no arguing that with people who know what they're talking about. And in chronological order, these three are Haydn, Franz Joseph Haydn, born 1732, lived until 1809. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, born in 1756, died in 1791, and Ludwig van Beethoven, born 1770, died 1827. All three of these men at least met each other or knew each other well. Haydn and Mozart were actually close friends, even though they're really of different generations, right? Haydn was born in 1732, same year as George Washington, by the way. Mozart born 1756, so a much younger man, yet Haydn respected Mozart above all other composers, said he is the greatest composer I've ever met, ever heard of, the greatest composer known to me. Beethoven also knew Haydn quite well because he studied with him for a couple of years and was well acquainted with him after that. Um, it's a little bit less clear about Mozart and Beethoven. It's not entirely clear that they ever met. There are stories of them meeting, and the book even recalls Beethoven actually did travel down to Vienna at one time specifically to meet Mozart and to begin studying with him. Beethoven says he met Mozart and played for Mozart, or at least people Beethoven talked to said that this happened. Mozart never made any mention of it, let's say in his letters or whatever. We have no account of this from Mozart's end, but we do have Beethoven's word for it that he did meet and play on one occasion for Mozart. Anyway, we're just going to focus on these three. Although I should mention very briefly that there is also the influence on all three of these of the sons of J.S. Bach. Remember I said J.S. Bach had several sons who were important composers. Two of them are really hugely influential. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who was the court composer to Frederick the Great, and Johann Christian Bach, Bach's youngest son, were each in turn major influences. They really, more than anyone else, they sort of codified and defined the classical style. C.P.E. Bach, the older son, was a major influence on Haydn, and J.C. Bach was a major influence on Mozart. In fact, the two of them met when Mozart traveled to London when he was like about 6 or 7 years old. They actually appeared in concert together. All right. Anyway, so we're going to focus on those three. And if we look at the careers of these three, we can see that the role of the composer is changing. Haydn spent most of his career in the typical kind of career that a Baroque composer might have had. He served a wealthy family, the Esterházy family, like very high nobility in Hungary. For most of his career, he was their court composer, and he was treated basically like a servant. He was an employee. Mozart's father had a very similar kind of position, working for a bishop/prince. Mozart was kind of expected to eventually get a job like that. But Mozart was a phenomenal child prodigy, of course, and was continuously on tour throughout Europe in his childhood. And it's very hard to go from this kind of career as a child superstar, the most famous musician in the world when you're only in the single-digit years, to then having the kind of job that Haydn had as a mere servant, being kind of bossed around and told what to do. And so this was very awkward. This was a difficult thing for Mozart to come to grips with. So he eventually attempted to break away and establish a freelance career. This is what he did the last 10 years of his life. He kind of he settled in Vienna and arranged concerts himself, occasionally traveled around also to other cities. And basically in those 10 years, he had like 5 good years and 5 not so good years. And a lot of that was simply due to Mozart's own sort of, his own personal issues. He was, of course, a phenomenal composer, but maybe not that astute of a businessman. And there's a business end to this kind of thing. He also spent money like a drunken sailor. We'll get to talking about all three of these in some more detail a little later on. But Beethoven, on the other hand, never had a career like his former teacher Haydn had had. Beethoven never worked as anyone's employee, as a court composer. Right? Beethoven is generally recognized to be among the first freelance composers. He's an independent artist. He never had to sort of take orders from anyone. And unlike Mozart, his freelance career was successful. And when he died, he was a pretty wealthy man. He never had this sort of falling off in popularity and going into debt and having financial problems, sort of like Mozart did. I've talked about this section talks about how composers, in addition, are trying to appeal to middle-class people, not just the aristocracy. So we can see that over the course of the classical era, as represented by the careers of these three composers, we can see that times are changing. And in an earlier time, like Haydn's time, it might not have been possible to have a freelance career and just, putting on public concerts that middle class people are going to go to, right? It starts to become possible, let's say during Mozart's time, although Mozart himself kind of struggles with it, with this kind of business model. And it's definitely possible by the time we get to Beethoven, because Beethoven is successful at it. So this kind of mirrors the rise in the wealth and power of the middle class that I've talked about, that is a feature of this time period, right? As the middle class becomes more prosperous, better educated, they have more disposable income, they have more time to go to concerts and play music at home, they have more disposable income, to spend on musical instruments or to spend on lessons, to spend on music. So composers in turn are very often appealing to this middle class audience and to middle class tastes, right? Finally, I know I'm skipping over a lot here, but Vienna. I've already mentioned Vienna was the musical capital of Europe during the classical era. All three of our great composers spent at least some time working here. Haydn settled in Vienna after his retirement and had kind of a second career based in Vienna. He actually also, early in his career, he was based in Vienna. He sang in the Vienna Boys Choir, in the choir of St. Stephen's Cathedral. Although the middle part of his career, working for this prince, he was usually off in the hinterlands of Hungary at this giant palace, the Esterházy Palace. Mozart, when he began his freelance career, settled in Vienna, spent the last 10 years of his life there, and also performed there on other occasions. Beethoven, although born in Bonn, Germany, moved to Vienna when he was about 20 years old and spent the rest of his life there until age 57. Right? So he was firmly based in Vienna. So all three of the greatest composers, and many others, many other great musicians, lived and worked in Vienna. Vienna is sort of like at a cultural crossroads in Europe. You've got Italy just to the south, right? Germany to the north. To the east, you have what would be called Bohemia. You have Eastern Europe, today Czechoslovakia, Hungary. And over to the west, you have France. So you have sort of different cultural currents flowing through Vienna, different languages spoken there, different influences in the arts. Of course, Vienna was at that time the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, which the old joke goes is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was sort of a shaky, semi-loose confederation of mostly German-speaking kingdoms and principalities and states, right? So it was an important big city, a city of about 250,000 people, which was huge by those days. It was about the fourth largest city in Europe. And Vienna is the backdrop against which much of what I'm going to talk about takes place. Although obviously there were composers and great music going on in other cities. It's just that if you really wanted to make it big in one place in particular, Vienna would be the place to do it. All right, I've gone on a bit too long. That's going to be it for now. We are going to talk about different genres, different forms of different movements within different genres beginning next time. See you then.